Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us again on the Seafood Matters podcast. In order to help our podcast, please press subscribe and share it with family and friends. Joining us today is Greg Mercer, author of the book The Lobster Trap. Hello, Greg, and welcome to Seafood Matters.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Thank you. It's great to have you. Please tell us about your career path and background.
Sure. So I grew up on the east coast of Canada in a little place called Darlings Island, New Brunswick. I started working for newspapers there for the daily newspaper in my hometown. And that's been about 25 years of my life is working for newspapers in this country. I'm now an investigative reporter for the Globe and Mail, which is a national newspaper that covers Canada and international issues that are of interest to Canadians. And so I'm based now in Ontario, but am home frequently on the East Coast reporting on the fishery and issues related to it.
That's great. So the East Coast is home for you.
That's right. Yeah.
What inspired you to write the book, The Lobster Trap, and how did you first become interested in the lobster industry?
Well, I guess growing up in the Maritimes, or that's what we call the eastern provinces in Canada, lobster was always in the background. My parents weren't fishermen, but there were people in my extended family who worked in the industry. Lobster was kind of the food that would show up at special occasions, right? It would show up for family gatherings, at Christmas or on the back porch in the summertime, and my father would get a load of lobster from one of the local fishing communities. But I never really thought a whole lot about it other than just that it seemed to be, a big part of coastal life. It wasn't until I was working as a reporter in 2020 for the Globe and Mail when we had this big fight erupt in Nova Scotia over who had the right to catch lobster. And what we saw was on one side there was indigenous fishermen, Mi'kmaq fishermen, so sort of native fishermen who were enacting what they felt was a treaty right to fish outside of the federal season. And you had commercial fishermen, mostly white, non-native fishermen on the other side who were very opposed to that. And it blew up into an international news event. There were riots. An angry mob burned down a fish warehouse. People were shooting at boats on the water. The National Police Force had to come in to bring in some peace. And I was sent as a reporter to try to make sense of this. And it got me thinking, why are we fighting this much over lobster? Isn't there plenty of lobster in the sea? Naively, that's what I thought. And I kind of learned through that process that no, there's a lot of folks who are worried about the future of this fishery. And that kind of got me thinking that there's a bigger story to tell. And I want to be able to tell more of the history and the politics and the evolution of lobster into a global food and tell that story in terms of how we got here. So that's kind of was the impetus for the book.
That's great. It's great. Absolutely. Can you share any personal experiences or encounters that shaped your perspective while researching the book?
It was an education for me, right? As I said, I came at this as a journalist and not a fisherman, not a marine biologist. I wanted to write a book for the average reader, try to help them understand all of these great challenges facing the industry and help them understand why we ought to care, because no fishery is worth more to Canada and to North America than lobster, and it's also an incredibly global food now. So I wanted people to understand what's at stake. I spent a lot of time on the water with fishermen. I had some great days where I thought, what a lovely job. It's sunny, it's calm. Who wouldn't want to do this? And I had days that were almost like a nightmare. Some of the conditions that particularly Canadian fishermen go out in late in the year, close to the Christmas season when they're trying to fill orders, they are going out in conditions when most sane people would not want to be on the water. And I went out early one morning at about 4:00, long before the sun rose, late in November, the day after a storm had just blown through in southern New Brunswick. And the storm was so violent that it actually knocked over a fish warehouse on the wharf. We went out the next day, and I've never seen ocean conditions like that and been in them personally and experienced it. It was terrifying, and I spent half my time being seasick. But the fishermen on the boat, for them, it was just another day at the office. And they had a job to do, and they had traps that were full, and they had to go and harvest them. So it was eye-opening for me to appreciate, one, how dangerous the job can be at times and how difficult the work is. they're out on the water harvesting long before most people even wake up in the morning. And it just gave me an appreciation for the work that fishermen do that's often out of sight. We don't see this. We see the lobster, in a grocery store fishing tank, or we see it on our plate, but we don't always appreciate how it got there.
When you say that, Greg, I'm 100% with you there. And it reminds me, which is the exact same as what you're saying there. Here's me, now it's a good number of years now. I'm standing on the port, Scrabster as it's called, in the north of Scotland. And a boat had just finished landing. I'm standing on the pier. He's finished landing, and all his stores and everything is finished. He's fueled up, ready to go. And I'm standing talking with the skipper until he says to me, "Well, Jim, it's all very well for you, but we could stand here all day chatting." But he says, "There's a storm of wind on the forecast, and I don't want to be stuck in here."
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean that's the thing especially with lobster fishing, is they have to go where the lobster are. They can't always pick and choose when to fish. I mean, they're not going to go out in extreme storms, but they have to go meet the lobster. They can't farm them. Not on a commercial scale. They are in some ways the last of the real hunter gatherers, and that means working with an ocean that's not often cooperative. And so I was really came away with a real appreciation and respect for the work that they do.
Totally. The title itself, it evokes a metaphor. What does the lobster trap symbolize in the broader social and economic context of this fishery? Because I just feel it's a clever title because it gives you so many different meanings that it could stand for.
Yeah, I guess the idea I'm trying to get across with that title is that fishermen, especially those who are heavily indebted, which we see in North America, very heavily indebted to get into the fishery, cannot afford to pull back on the reins in terms of the fishing effort that they're doing and this sort of all-out fishing. But as part of that heavy fishing effort, it's a race to the bottom, right? That they are in some ways speeding up the decline that we're beginning to see in the North American fishery. And so I just wanted to get that very simple idea across, that fishermen in some ways cannot afford to pull back. I think older fishermen who their debts are paid off might be able to fish a little less and do it in a more sustainable way. But for young fishermen in North America, that's not the case. They have to fish as hard as they can and catch as many lobsters as they possibly can to pay their debts. But in the process, they are speeding up the decline of their own industry.
That's one thing I have to say, that I'm talking myself from somebody that's been in the fishing industry all my life. And I find your story, the book, Greg, is fascinating from the point of view. It's not just men in white coats that are coming with scientific studies and surveys. It's almost like the opposite. The demand is a culprit almost.
Yeah, that was part of the story that I wanted to tell. I wanted people to understand, big picture, when we create a food that the world wants, what does that mean when we know this is a limited resource? And so I wanted to follow that story to the end. And I tried to do that. It took me around the world. I went to China and South Korea, where there's a market for lobster in the way that there wasn't 20 or 25 years ago. And I want to understand the consequences of that, right? Because the lobster that I'm writing about, North American lobster and European lobster, only come from a relatively small part of the globe. We can't make them grow anywhere else. And so I wanted to understand, what does it mean when the world gets a taste for that shellfish and wants an endless supply of it.
It'd be interesting to get your view. I read it in your book. It was almost like the fact that people, maybe a restaurant or something, was telling you, "Oh, we can't afford lobster." It was almost like it was a problem. What I would say, I would feel, well, no, because it's high end and it is luxury food.
Hmm.
Does that not put a limit on the demand?
I do think we'll reach that point for sure, that the price will become sort of out of reach for people for it to be a more common food, right? I think we're already getting there, really. I mean, North America catches an awful lot of lobster, more than anywhere else in the world. And you are seeing sometimes when the price, seasonally will go beyond the reach of what restaurants want to pay, and they'll take it off the menu. That's a relatively new phenomenon, right? I mean, we're talking about something that in the 1990s, you could walk into a McDonald's fast food restaurant and get a lobster sandwich for about $4. Those days are long gone. And I think that you're right. The market will ultimately have a role to play here when consumers just say, this is not something we're going to pay for, or we're not going to eat as often. It really becomes a special occasion food. So you're right. We can't remove the impact of the market and pricing from this whole story.
Exactly. Greg, this might be another book for you. We have almost the opposite situation, possibly Europe wide, where with whitefish,
Mhm.
whereas the market is paying more and more and more for big fish, bigger fish like the largest sizes of different species. And they're like what was our traditional fish for pretty much most of the UK and certainly Scotland was haddock.
Mhm.
And the smaller size of haddock, which was the what you would expect to get in the fish and chip shops and the fishmongers. The buyers and the merchants tell us now, oh, that's not what the market wants. The market
Mhm.
wants bigger fish. But it's coming to the stage, Greg, where the bigger fish, we're going to have a problem with them. And the smaller fish that was the market in the past, they don't want that now.
Mhm.
And that's not conserving stocks to the point of view where fishermen, it can give them an income without overdoing it on other species.
This is it. We can't talk about seafood species without talking about the impact of the global marketplace, right? As we globalize these foods and we develop markets for them in places that traditionally did not have that part of their culture in terms of eating the food that we're now catching. That upends all the old rules around how and when they're caught and what people are willing to pay and what we value. And that has enormous consequences on a fishery. So that is something I tried to explain or at least understand in the book.
Yeah, and very well, very, very well. But we're reaching a stage now when I say that, for just say the two species small haddock, the fishermen can't get enough money out of them to make it worth their while landing them. Cod is getting to the stage, it's getting more expensive and more expensive, so they're getting a bigger price on that. And what have we got just now? We have ICES recommending zero cod for 2026. There's a next book, Cod Trap. So it is a
Yeah,
trap.
yeah. And we've seen this story play out time and time again. We saw the cod fishery collapse in North America because of overfishing, and that upends a whole way of life for a lot of folks. And you think about our connection to food and you think about fish and chips in the UK. What does it mean for the future of fish and chips in the UK if this is what's happening in the fishery?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's
But
fascinating, fascinating.
yeah, your book examines the global lobster trade. Which regions of the countries have the most fascinating or surprising practices in lobster management?
Well, I mean, the different countries handle it differently, as we would expect. I was surprised as part of my research going to places like Ireland or the UK where they catch lobster. They're catching European lobster, obviously a different species, and it's a much smaller scale than what we're catching in Canada and the US. But I had industry folks in places like Bridlington, UK, the lobster capital of Europe, saying we actually don't have a good handle on how many lobster are being harvested every year. We don't have great tools always to measure the size of the catch, which is problematic if you're trying to make informed decisions about conservation. But we have the very same problem in Canada, and I was surprised to learn that in my research that yes, we've had this great lobster boom in this country that's generated enormous wealth, but as part of that, we also have a black market that some regulators think might be as large as 30% of the total catch. So basically, 30% of all the lobster being caught are not being recorded. They're off the books. They're being sold to seafood buyers through cash sales. that's deeply problematic if you're trying to make informed decisions about the size of the stock and the health of the stock. And so these are the kind of things that were very eye opening to me to realize this is the kind of stuff that's happening on the wharves and in the harbors, up and down this country.
I read that in your book and I was surprised because I thought, well, okay, maybe fisheries are not picking it up themselves. The what we would call the fishery officers,
Mm-hmm.
who would be monitoring and the catches and taking all the records. But then I thought, when I was reading it in your book, Greg, I thought, well, surely the Mr. Taxman
Well,
is going to.
that's why they're doing it, for tax reasons, right? It keeps it off the books so you don't have to pay income tax, right? If you're a lobster captain who has made $600,000 in income, there's quite a tax implication, and so there are some people who are incentivized to keep things off the books. And this is in an environment where we don't have enough fisheries officers to really monitor every wharf, every dock. There's so many boats, thousands and thousands of crews going out. They don't have the resources, frankly, to keep tabs on it. And so even the industry acknowledges this is a problem. There's a debate over how big the black market is. Some say it's as small as 10%. Some say it's as large as 30%. But it's clearly there. It exists. And I'm arguing in the book that it's not good if we're concerned about the future of the sustainability of the fishery.
Oh, definitely. But the way I would say that, well, certainly the way we would look at it, it's one thing to maybe hide something from a fishery officer. It's a whole other thing to hide it from the taxman.
This is it. Yeah, this is it. And the tax man always wins, right? As they say. So I do know that at multiple levels of government, they are concerned about it. They want to crack down on it. They brought in these digital logbooks to try to improve reporting among fishing boats. So they think that might be part of the problem, that the paperwork is too much, so they simply don't report. Remains to be seen if they can shrink the size of the black market. But when lobster is so valuable, there's always going to be someone willing to pay cash and keep things off
Yeah,
the books.
yeah. It's a high value product.
Mm-hmm.
How do trade wars, international demand, and pricing volatility impact lobster fishermen differently across the world?
I mean, it's yet another curveball that fishermen in different parts of the world are dealing with. Depends on what country you're fishing in, right? In 2018, when the first Donald Trump administration had a trade war with Beijing, American lobster fishermen were badly hurt by that. It devastated American lobster exports to China. China simply slammed the door shut. And this is a massive market. China buys more
Yeah,
live lobster than any other country in the world. So what that did was open the door for Canadian seafood companies to sort of come in, and they made great gains and established all kinds of new buying partnerships. Now we're seeing the inverse of that. Now Canada and Beijing are having a trade spat, and lobster's caught up in it. And China often uses lobster uh, as a tool because they know it's so valuable to both Canada and the U.S. And so Canadian exports to China have plummeted, and everyone is sort of waiting to see how long is this trade war going to last. And trade wars come and go, and we know that. But they can cause enormous pain, even if it's short term, for an industry. So the volatility just seems to never end, right? And it affects everything from the price to how hard fishermen are fishing. They have one thing we're seeing in Canada now is this desperate search to find other markets, to develop other markets in other parts of the world, because there's kind of this awakening that, wow, if China just with a stroke of the pen says we're going to tariff Canadian lobster, that has a huge impact here. So they're saying, well, maybe we need to sell more lobster in other places.
I was surprised. You might say I shouldn't have been, but I did a recent podcast with he's a scientist in the University of Washington on the West Coast, Seattle,
Mhm.
and he was saying that the the price is driven more by China, and China is paying a bigger price. And I thought this is crazy. In my mind, American market would pay more than China, but the American lobster was going to China. I was
Hmm.
thought that was bizarre.
I mean, the American markets, from the Canadian perspective, is still massive. They buy 4 times the total lobster that China does, but China is the most important when it comes to live lobster. That's what they want, is the whole lobster that arrive at the airport still alive. The Americans want more processed lobster, lobster that's sometimes canned, that can be put into food products. But you're right. China wants a massive volumes of lobster, but they want it at a price point. And there are Canadian seafood companies who will complain that yes, we sell an awful lot of lobster to China, but they can be a difficult customer sometimes, and sometimes there's not a great margin for us left over. That's a complaint from them. So, but I think as consumers, we can look at China and say, well, hey, is that the reason that we're paying $35 now for a lobster sandwich? That would have cost a quarter of that 2 decades ago, and I think you can safely say that yes, that's a big part of the reason.
I I think this is myself personally, which gobsmacked me. I was going to my family. We were going to Florida quite a bit from about maybe the late '80s to the early 2000s, just about the turn of the into 2000, all right through the '90s. We would go to restaurants, and I was getting, and this is not on a fishmonger. I was buying steamed lobster for $10.50, and that's what it cost me in the restaurant for a steamed Maine lobster. And this has really taken this back to my mind when I've been reading your book. Earlier this year, my brother and his wife were going to Boston because their daughter was running the Boston Marathon.
Hmm.
So he called me and he says, "What's your recommendations on seafood?" I says to him, "Well," I says, "I don't know if they're still in the go, but try legal seafoods. But," I says, "you'll have to go for lobster because it's fantastic and it's much, much cheaper than you'll pay in this country." He came back and he told me he got a lobster roll and it cost him $35.
This is it. The New York Times had a great story a couple of years ago that's saying, have we reached peak lobster roll prices? Like, have we kind of reached the tipping point that people, but this great age of abundance, this great lobster boom that we've seen, it certainly is on the decline. And what does that mean for consumers? As global demand only continues to rise, we're just going to pay more and more until your point earlier that eventually there is a tipping point where people refuse to pay. But yeah, the days of cheap lobster are gone. There's no question.
Yeah, well gone. Yeah, because as I said, that was me paying $10.50
Yeah,
in the '90s, and he was 35.
yeah, it's unreal. And then just in a couple of decades, it's changed that much.
Yeah, would that lobster roll? There wouldn't be a whole lobster in that roll, would there?
No, so they're buying the knuckle, and claw meat. Sometimes there's a bit of tail meat.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they're buying like a cheaper lobster. You might get sometimes
Oh,
two
of
ounces,
course.
3 ounces of meat. A really good one might have 4 ounces of meat. But as the price goes up, they try to fill it with other things. And sometimes they'll get caught putting shrimp in, or they'll get caught putting more celery or something, trying to spread it out because it's such an expensive protein.
Is there any thoughts if the cod fishing impacted on the lobster fishing?
Definitely. So lobster, juvenile lobster, are very vulnerable to predators, and codfish are kind of top of the pile, right? Codfish are a major predator in the ocean, and one of the theories that explains why in the 1990s we saw this great surge in lobster populations in North America is that it coincides with the collapse of the cod fishery. So you
Yeah,
remove this kind of apex predator from the ecosystem, and you get this sudden explosion in lobster populations. I think combined with warming ocean water kind of hitting a sweet spot for lobster production, we kind of saw this great growth in lobster numbers. But yes, you're right. Predators and predation are a big part of the story. And now we're seeing in the southern part of the fishery in the U.S. and in New England, places like Connecticut, Rhode Island, they're seeing sort of sea bass and predators they would have normally seen in more southern waters moving up into traditional lobster fishing territory and devouring the juvenile lobster there. So, the old rules of lobster are out the window, and it's opened the door to new predators moving in. And as old predators disappear, it's opened opportunity for lobster to grow, but the rules just keep changing. They just do not stay the same. And I think fishermen, yet again, are being forced to adapt. And we're seeing this around the world. We're seeing it in France, actually, where lobster fishermen are reporting that they're pulling up their traps and they're finding octopus in their traps. Octopus are kind of moving into more northern waters, and they're devouring lobster, shell and all, in a way that we didn't see 20 years ago. So, predators are part of the puzzle, and yet another challenge that lobster fishermen are dealing with.
That is a major issue in the southwest of the UK in Cornwall. Like the Channel and that, there's an enormous amount of. In fact, it's actually turned for some of them to the benefit, because some of the boats are catching the octopus and they're having the best years they've ever had.
Right.
But it's not helping lobster.
No, it's created an unexpected, bycatch, or an unexpected market for them. But you're right; it is causing a lot of problems if you're still trying to catch lobster.
Exactly. What role does industrialization play in creating both wealth and vulnerability in this multi-billion-dollar industry?
I mean, it has a huge role to play. I think the scale of the lobster fishery is part of the issue, part of the challenge, right? Boats are getting bigger and bigger, and they're fishing longer, going further to sea. We've basically built this massive global exporting machine designed to catch as many lobster off the bottom of the sea as we can. And for someone whose grandfather fished in the fishery, that would be unrecognizable, because not that long ago, it was still very much a small scale fishery with small, sometimes dories and a handful of traps, and they would pull up the traps by hand. As we've mechanized the fishery and used technology to find where lobster are, and sort of increase just the volume of lobster that we're able to catch, that's had enormous impact on, one, the supply, so we can now supply and send it around the world, but also the impact on the species. So, that evolution is the story I try to tell in the book about how lobster grew from this kind of part-time seasonal fishery into a year-round industry designed to feed a world with an endless appetite for lobster.
You highlight historic conflicts over lobster rights, including Indigenous exclusion in Canada. How have communities responded and adapted to these challenges?
That's been a big deal in Canada, and we're starting to see that play out in the U.S. a little bit too. But basically, this is a fight that's been brewing for decades. That Indigenous folks in Canada have largely been excluded, at least on a commercial scale, from the lobster fishery. And what we're starting to see now is that First Nation groups, so different Indigenous communities around Atlantic Canada, are saying, "Hey, we want a piece of the pie. Lobster has been this great success story, and we want in." And we have these centuries-old treaty rights, these agreements that we signed with the British colonial government long before Canada was a country. And those treaties made it clear that we had the right to harvest fish and seafood for a moderate livelihood. And we had a Supreme Court decision 20 years ago in Canada that affirmed that right and said, yes, we cannot dispute that right. The question now is, what does that look like in 2025? Because what the treaties they signed in the 1700s with the British were not for a modern commercial scale fishery. And so that's kind of where the debate and the tension is in North America is one is, how big does it get? Two, who has the right to regulate that fishery, right? There are some First Nations groups who say no Canadian government official has the right to tell us when and how to fish for lobster. And in a country where it's tightly regulated and you can only fish at certain times of the year, that has ruffled feathers among commercial fishermen who say, hey, we all need to play by the same rules. And so as a country, we're still trying to sort that out. And we do not yet have clarity on what that's going to look like. But there are still groups fishing in the views of commercial fishermen, still fishing illegally today. And they are sort of fighting for their right to have a piece of the pie. So that tension has not gone away.
You would almost say they would need to hurry up from reading the book. They would need to hurry up and fix it.
Well, if the goal is to have a sustainable fishery that in another generation is still providing good jobs and still supplying a reliable supply of lobster to the world, we need to have these questions resolved. We can't have people playing by different sets of rules when it comes to how and when we fish, right? And I think there's a lot of science that says there are times of the year when you should not fish in terms of the lobster are molting and when they're at their the species is most sensitive to fishing impact. I think we need to all kind of get on the same page, and I think that there's a lot of indigenous groups who recognize that, but there are some who do not want to play by the same rules, and that has been a difficult fight to resolve.
And within that fight, where do politicians come in, or is it? We feel in this country, it's almost like, well, they don't want the hassle of it. They would rather give it to the
It,
industry.
it's the same. It's the same problem here. Is that politicians? No politician wants to stand up and make difficult decisions that will be unpopular, right? And sometimes unpopular decisions are necessary, right, for
Yeah,
the future of the fishery. Um, and so we're seeing that play out. That this issue has kind of been kicked down the road by different governments,
yeah.
saying we'll let the next guy worry about it. But it's going to come to a head that it needs to be answered once and for all, and we need to have kind of a deal that brings everyone into the fold in a way that all sides can agree. Because there are a lot of fishermen that are worried, how big can it get if every indigenous person in Canada says I have a right to fish for lobster. What's that going to look like, and what's the impact on the species? I mean, I don't think it's still a small scale when we talk about how much lobster is being caught by the commercial fishery, but it's a growing concern, and it needs to be addressed.
One of the things that I wouldn't say shocked me, but certainly makes me take note of the mind-boggling figures you talk about in tonnages and values and that, and for it to be so important as far as the country is concerned,
Mm-hmm.
because coming from the UK or talking from the UK, our biggest fear as far as fishing industry is concerned here, Greg, we're such a small percentage of the GDP, and it's just in minute percentages.
Mm-hmm.
Less than 5% of the gross domestic product in the UK is fishing, so they don't class it as important.
I mean, this is it. So, I mean, just in the Canadian context, something like $14 billion worth of lobster were exported in the last 5 years. I mean, you can't overstate the importance of that as an industry to the country, and particularly in the eastern part of Canada, it's worth as much as the auto parts sector is to places like Ontario, or oil and gas is to Alberta. It is a massive industry. It employs tens of thousands of people. It generates billions of dollars in revenue. It is not a small scale seasonal fishery. It economically, it's sort of a nation. It's a critical industry for the nation, and so that's why these questions of how are we going to manage it, who has the right to catch it, are critical. They need to be they
Yeah.
need to be resolved. I think now is the time.
Are there any particularly compelling human stories, fishermen or families whose experiences have included that illustrate the aches of this industry?
Yeah, I mean, I crisscrossed the globe to tell this story. I spent a lot of time with fishermen in the northwestern part of the U.S., where their fishery has really collapsed. Fishermen like Michael Grimshaw, he is a longtime fisherman who's been fishing since the 1970s in Connecticut. And Connecticut is actually home of the lobster roll. This is the place that invented the lobster sandwich. At one time, this was the very heart of America's lobster fishery. And today, there is virtually no lobster fishery left. There is a handful of fishermen still catching it. In many cases, people like Michael told me it's not even worth our while to go out to cover. We can't even cover the cost of fuel. There's so few lobster left. And he tells this story of in the 1990s, they couldn't catch lobster fast enough. He said you could go out 7 days a week and you'd come back and your traps would be full. And he said, the collapse was so sudden and so with such very little warning that it was like a hurricane coming in and crashing ashore. And he said this just upended an entire way of life. That all of these little coastal communities that used to be working waterfronts with fishermen, those families sold their boats and they moved to into to different towns. And the whole way that Connecticut shoreline looks now is different than it did 25 years ago because of the collapse. And so I just wanted to understand is what does it mean for a region when a fishery that mattered so much can just vanish like that? And while we haven't seen that kind of severe collapse in more northern parts, we're seeing signs that catches are declining. And so people are saying when the decline comes, it can happen very quickly and sometimes without a lot of warning. So people like Michael Grimshaw help me understand what it's like. I mean, he basically calls himself he's the last lobsterman in Connecticut, right? There's a few others, but he's holding on by the skin of his teeth, trying to make a living, and it's been a really hard go for him.
Wow. Well, that's, I mean, what lesson could other fisheries or industries learn from the sociopolitical dynamics of lobstering?
I mean, I think that we have to make decisions based on ecological factors and not just economic ones. I mean, I understand you cannot remove the economic considerations. These industries mean a lot to coastal communities, but you can't ignore ecological data and some of the warnings that it's providing us. And I think that um, it's too late to be reactive, right? If you wait until they did in Connecticut and now they're trying to rebuild a fishery that appears to be long gone, you've lost your chance. So I do think that there are things that can be done to improve sustainability, to give the species a better chance in the North American context to survive and have hopefully another 20 years of good fishing. But we need to start making those changes now.
How are climate change impacting lobster populations, and what might the future hold for the industry if current trends continue?
Climate change is probably the biggest existential crisis facing the fishery. Lobster are incredibly sensitive creatures, and we know from a lot of research that they kind of have a sweet spot for survival, which is between about 12 and 18 degrees Celsius. And as the average ocean temperatures move beyond that, and especially in the summertime, it creates a lot of stress for lobster and affects everything from the way they migrate to the way they reproduce to the way they fend off things like shell disease. And so, as the ocean warms, the whole game of lobstering is changing. And in northern regions like Newfoundland, where we didn't traditionally have a big booming lobster fishery, it's now getting to the point where they're catching phenomenal catches, where they're catching 5 times what they caught 4 years ago, because the water's kind of warmed to the point that's sort of now very productive. But in the southern part of the fishery here, it's the inverse of that it's now too warm and lobster cannot survive. And so that change is very real. Fishermen, I have not met a fisherman yet who denies that it's happening. They may not agree on what's causing it, but they're saying, look, the ocean is changing. We know that. We see it every year. And we're very concerned about where this is all going.
Indeed, every reason to be. Are there innovative or sustainable practices emerging that could reshape the lobster trade?
Well, I mean, there are yes, there's small examples of that. There are some places where they are trying to they're voluntarily choosing to use fewer traps. In some places in Maine, trying to say let's collectively agree to just catch fewer lobster, and hopefully we can, in our little corner of the fishery, have a more sustainable catch. There are people who are still researching the question of can we farm lobster. And while it's been proven that you can raise lobster in a hatchery, the problem is it's hard to do it on a commercial scale and in a cost-effective way that replicates what the ocean does naturally. So I spoke to biologists, of people like Brian Beal in Maine, who's shown you can do this. You can raise lobster and you can release them. The problem is the lobster are so slow growing, and in those 7 years that it takes them to kind of grow to full size, they're so vulnerable to cannibalism, like the lobster eat each other, to predators, to all kinds of factors that it's just really hard to do it. But There are some folks who say, maybe there is hope there, that if we can learn to farm lobster in the way that we farm oyster or salmon, that we might be able to find a new way to grow this as a food.
Is there people trying that?
Yes, so yeah, Brian Beal in Maine is doing it on a small scale. He's a biologist from the University of Maine. What he's able to produce are they're like miniature lobster. He think of it as like a crawfish, like it's about a 3 or 4 inch lobster. He said you don't think of it as a traditional lobster. He's trying to create basically a new market for it. It looks like a lobster, but it looks like a miniature lobster. That would require some convincing of consumers to eat lobster in a different way. And I don't know that we're there yet, but certainly a lot of people have tried this. The company Red Lobster, the restaurant chain, a big American seafood restaurant chain,
Yeah.
sunk millions of dollars into this question, and basically had to walk away from it because they found they could not do it on a commercial scale farming lobster.
Are they still on the go? Are they still operating?
They have gone through various restructuring, and they're trying to keep the brand alive, but their parent company basically sold them off and said, the future of Red Lobster is uncertain. But the part of the issue for Red Lobster is that their namesake protein, the price was so volatile and so expensive, and so they've tried to figure out how do we continue to be Red Lobster when the thing we've built our name around is becoming increasingly expensive, and that is an ongoing challenge for them.
Yeah, they don't want to have their name tagged with something that's so problematic.
That's right.
Yeah. I just feel as well now, this is just in my head, and you can tell me I'm away from the mark, but from the areas you talk about, is it what did you call them? The
maritime provinces. Yeah, that's
provinces.
The three. That's right.
Yeah, that'll be Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and
Prince Edward Island.
Prince Edward Island.
Yeah. And then Newfoundland is not part of the Maritimes. Newfoundland is part of what we call Atlantic Canada.
Yeah.
But those are the four sort of biggest lobster catching provinces in this country.
When I'm looking at as I said earlier, the mind-blowing tonnages and values of the fishery, I'm thinking, well, let's face it, I'm talking from the UK. Now, if you look at the coastline of your three provinces, it'll take in probably 10 or more times the coastline of the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So that would make it explain why there's so much more than the UK.
I think so. I think that the North American lobster as a species have kind of evolved to thrive in that environment, right? And we have built this industry exclusively to haul as many of those up. So we kind of built it up over decades to get to this scale. But yeah, it naturally produces just significant volumes of lobster. And I think part of what we see too in the European context is that they've also been catching lobster for much longer. And while the species is different, I think there are some similarities. And one of the things we have to wonder is what's been the impact of all of those years of kind of unchecked or unregulated fishing of lobster around the British Isles, and what does that mean in 2025? And I don't know if we have a good handle on that, but I think that part of that history might explain why it's smaller.
When you mention that, is there any regulation in the maritime provinces for the lobster or the catching?
The way that they regulate it is through limited licenses. So you have to buy a federally approved license, and sometimes you can pay $1 million for that license because it's a limited access fishery. And they also regulate it through the number of traps you're allowed to use as part of that license. So in Canada, the maximum is 350 traps. In many parts of the U.S., it's 800 traps. I spoke to fishermen in the UK who said they might use a rotation of 1,200 traps. So Canada has much tougher restrictions around the total number of traps that you can use under your lobster license.
Is that per crewman or per boat?
Per boat. It's assigned to the boat.
Yeah. I know one of the thoughts some of us have here, Greg, is from a point of view of sustainable, as far as the industry is concerned, and new young people coming into it, one of the biggest mistakes we feel has been made here is putting a value on quota and a value on license,
Hmm.
because the chances of a young guy leaving school, getting a job on a boat, working his way up, becoming skipper, or eventually having his own boat, that's impossible now.
We have the same problem here. So because it's a limited access fishery, and you have to buy your way in, there are many cases where that lobster license can cost you $1 million, or $800,000. But if you're a young fisherman and you're not in your 20s, that's a significant amount of debt to take on, and you've got to pay that debt back. And so you cannot afford to slow down your you can't ask those people to start catching less, right? They are under enormous pressure
Yeah.
to catch as much as they can because of the debt loads that they're dealing with. So that we can't remove that from one of the challenges facing the industry when we talk about the need for conservation and sustainability, is that the young fishermen in particular are under enormous financial stress. And while there's this perception that it's this great booming industry, and yes, it has generated a lot of wealth, the cost to young fishermen is enormous to enter into the fishery.
Indeed, indeed. Well, it's very relevant here. Your book touches on greed, wealth, resource management. How do you see these themes resonating beyond the lobster industry?
Well, I guess the idea is that we have seen this. We have seen this before, right? When the world gets a taste for something, and is willing to pay good prices for it, we don't have a great track record of slowing down, right? We will try to squeeze every last drop out of it, and we've done it, throughout time in the fishery with different species, and we're doing it now with lobster. And part of the story of food now is that many foods are globalized, and lobster is no different. So it is natural that fishermen are going to do what the market incentivizes them to do, which is to catch as much lobster as they can. There's no quota in lobster. There's no limit on the maximum volume you can catch. So you can catch as much as the market will sustain, and the market's appetite is limitless. And so that is a problem when we're dealing with a finite resource. So that tension, you can't remove it from the story of lobster, and you can't remove it from any limited resource. And we know that these resources do have a limit. So that is something that a lot of people are worried about and wondering where this is all going.
If you could advocate one key change in the policy or consumer behaviour to
Mhm.
preserve the fishery, what would it be?
Well, I think for consumers, unfortunately, it might mean we have to be willing to pay more for lobster. And I know in the European context, people have traditionally paid more for local lobster, for European lobster. It may be that we may have to be okay with that. If we want, to catch fewer lobster, it means we're going to pay more. But there are things we can do in terms of regulating minimum and maximum size restrictions. In Canada, there's no maximum limit on the size of a lobster that you can catch. The jumbo lobster, that's a problem because the larger the lobster, the better breeders they are, the more eggs they produce, which is your next generation of lobster. So uh, we don't put a limit on that in Canada because it is so highly valued in Asian countries, particularly in the Chinese market. The U.S. Actually does have a limit on maximum size, and that's a source of contention between American and Canadian lobster fishermen. But size restrictions on both ends, both raising the minimum size to give lobster more time to grow and reproduce, and more restrictions on the maximum size, which would allow your best breeders, to survive and to produce more eggs. Those things would help the species, and those are two things that we can do separate from what's happening in the ocean. Regulators could do that tomorrow if they wanted to.
Are your boats restricted on landing buried lobsters?
Yes, yes. So, and fishermen have often led the way with that. The many programs where they'll, before even it was federal law, they would throw back egg-bearing females and mark them with the V notch, so that the
Yeah.
next fisherman who pulled it up could see that it was buried and marked. And there's fines if you're caught with a buried female. That wasn't always the case, and I think fishermen eventually realized if we want to have this fishery, if we want our kids to have a sustainable fishery, we have to protect those egg bearing females. So yes, that's a big one of the ways where fishermen have really led the way in terms of conservation.
I think it's felt here as well, Greg, that it's a major contribution to helping the
Mm-hmm.
stocks.
Yeah, it's been going on for decades here, and it just makes sense, right? That if you want to catch more lobster in 5 years, you ought to let those eggs back into the sea. There
Yeah.
was a time when we didn't fish it was just volume, and we didn't care if it was male or female, egg bearing or not. Catch them all, catch as much as we could. The turn of the century, that was the style of fishing, and we saw a collapse in the 1920s as a result of that. And so modern conservation measures do have a role, and we know that they can make an impact.
Is there any thought that it might, we talk here about fisheries, different fisheries that take off and come on, and is it going beyond that, or could it just be something that's going on the fishery could come back?
So I mean, there are some people hoping that it could come back. The thing is, we just don't know, and we don't have control over the nature's timetable, right?
Yeah.
There are people in the southern part of the fishery in the U.S. who have waited 25 years for a sign that it's coming back, and there's still no sign that it's coming back. So
Okay.
can we wait around long
No.
enough for it to come
Yeah.
back? We don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, you do hear that from fishermen that it's cyclical, right? And they'll say, "Oh well, my grandfather told me stories that there would be good years and bad years." But we're not talking about annual blips. We're talking about historical downward trends that
Yeah.
might take a century to turn around, and we don't have that kind of time, right?
And we don't want another saying I often make, Greg, from talking with fishermen and meeting fishermen. I've never met the fisherman yet who wants to catch the last one of any species.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean that's ultimately what one of the things I'm trying to tell with the book is that this starts with fishermen. No one has a more vested interest in this fishery surviving than fishermen themselves. They don't want to run this into the ground. And when they're doing things like catching at maximum effort, it's because that's what the market is kind of incentivizing them to do. But if fishermen want this thing to survive and they care about it and they want their kids to pick up that tradition.
Yeah.
And so I think you have to involve fishermen if you're talking about what conservation looks like and what regulation might look like into the future. I mean, they're an essential part of the puzzle.
What surprised you most during your research? Something readers might find particularly eye-opening?
I've just been surprised at how much the world has developed a taste for a food that I, as a kid, always thought was a regional food. I went to places like Qingdao, China, where they have lobster on the sidewalk in these bubbling tanks. And you can walk up and sit in a plastic chair and point to the lobster you want, and they'll cook it for you, on the side of the road in a wok, right? And then within 5 minutes, you've got a lobster that came from Nova Scotia, flown halfway around the world and sitting on your table. That you can go to Dubai and get a lobster roll served in a fancy restaurant, and the lobster came from Maine. And again, I always thought of this as like a regional food from my summer, childhood memories. And now this has become normalized that we should have lobster in any corner of the planet. And I think just that story just amazed me, that now we have developed a system that has allowed that to happen. And we are taking a food and it has truly become a global food.
I just find the size of the fishery is just mind-blowing. It's a fantastic read, I have to say, Greg, and my goodness, well done with it. But it certainly opens eyes and minds.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. My only hope is the book starts a conversation, right? It starts a conversation, gets us thinking about lobster and the fishery and where our lobster come from and where this is all going. That's my ultimate hope.
Well, that's what I thought earlier when we talked about the title, because you ask, and even more so as you go into the book. Well, okay, it's a trap, but who's trapped?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. And we have done this. We have created this problem ourselves, right? And so the hope is that it's up to us to figure a way out of it.
At least you don't have problem. Well, I don't think you have the problem. Certainly not with the lobster fishing. Our problem is more with whitefish. You've got the problem with supplying a foreign market. We've got the foreign boats coming in and fishing our waters, and our government has opened up and said, "Come in."
Yeah, and this is it. And we know there's a limit to these seafoods, right? And we've seen this happen in the North American context when we allowed foreign trawlers to come in and catch codfish, and we saw that fishery collapse. So I would be very concerned if you sort of let the world into your water to catch a seafood that you know is a limited resource.
Yeah. But also, I feel that when it is a natural resource like a lobster, nobody's got the right to think it should be cheap food.
Well, this and not, you're right, and we should appreciate as consumers that it's difficult to catch, it's dangerous work. We
Yeah,
should not take it for granted that it's sitting on our plate. You have to appreciate the people at every step of the way who work to bring it to you. You can't farm these things. You can't just grow them. We it's a bit of a marvel when you look at a lobster sitting on a plate. You think about the journey it's taken to arrive in front of you, and think about where it came from and what it was involved in
yeah,
getting it off the bottom of the sea. We have to have just an appreciation for that, and so that part of the reason why it is not a cheap food.
definitely, and shouldn't be. What do you hope readers take away from the lobster trap, both in terms of knowledge and emotional connection?
I mean, I just hope that it makes consumers care a little bit about lobster and about the future of lobster as a species, but also of the fishery. There's an awful lot riding on this. A lot of families whose jobs are tied up in the fishery around the globe, and I think we ought to care about the impact that we have as consumers on things like lobster. It's an incredible miracle of nature that we've been given this bounty of lobster, but let's not ruin it because we got too greedy. And so I'm just hoping we can pause and think a little bit more about lobster, and maybe start to ask, our politicians, our regulators, to maybe make some difficult choices to make sure it sticks around.
Yeah. Do you have any upcoming projects or research that expand on the themes of the book?
I think my next book will have to be on salad, Jim, just to help myself get healthy again. I ate so much lobster in the research phase for this one. No immediate plans. I mean, I will continue to cover the fishery from time to time. But I cover a wide range of subjects at the Globe and Mail. But I'll always have an interest in the fishery and in the ocean, and those stories will always have appeal to me.
Excellent. If a young lobster fisherman asked you for guidance on navigating this industry today, what advice would you feel you would give him?
Well, I would say I would be concerned about the debt loads that they have to take on to get into it. I would also remind them that they have an impact on the future of the species, right? That they can't just ignore their own role. Yeah, this population survival, right? So fishermen can't remove themselves from that, and don't let the debt of the debt loads of getting into this fishery kind of cloud that, right? That they still have a role to play, and I think most fishermen understand that. But particularly when you're young and getting into it, the financial stress is so great that you may focus on that exclusively.
Yeah, excellent. Can you please tell our listeners how they can follow you online?
Yeah, sure. They can follow me on Instagram if they want at Greg underscore Mercer. They can follow me on X at Greg Mercer Globe, which I use for the newspaper. And if people are interested in the book, it's available in most UK bookstores. Can order it for them. It's on Amazon. You can have it delivered to your house if you'd like. So yeah, and I'm happy to hear from people. They want to get in touch if they've got thoughts on the book. I'd love to hear from folks wherever they may be.
Well, I certainly feel from where I am in the book, people picking it up to read it, buying it to read it, will certainly be getting in touch because it's fantastic. It really is.
Thank you, Jim. I really
Well done.
appreciate that.
No, I would say well done. I really feel it. I mean what I say. And it's maybe a good time to just fold up. And I'll just say thank you very much, Greg, and good luck with the book and your future.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.